Welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you're here. You are going to love this today. My new friend, who I think will be friends for years and years and years to come, Mike Hassel. He is a best-selling author. His book is one that everybody should buy and have on their bookshelf and give away at Christmas and give away on birthdays and any other time you can think of giving it away because there's so much wisdom packed into one book. And I think it's something that is life changing. So buy the book. It is called Deep Trade Offs: Restoring Balance and Respect in a Polarized, Angry World. Right? So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you for those kind remarks. Um, that book was about 4 years in the making, actual writing, and about 20 years of thinking before that. And so, I'm just kind of just past retirement and decided to spend my time articulating what I thought I had learned. And it's mostly about just seeing the world differently. And it's not science to prove something. It's pretty self apparent, I think. Um, and most of the people I've talked to about it seem to agree that this is it's very different, but it's not strange.
Yeah, different and strange really are kind of two different things.
Right.
So, what inspired you to write it though? Like, what was going on in life, or what have you learned in life that you thought I need to write this book right now?
It starts with an aha moment at about age 40 when I was in an audio publishing business on the great ideas of history. And we had done audio tapes on philosophy, religion, science, political thought, economics. And this one was on the moral problems of our age. Now, you have to realize I was born into a family of engineers. My uncles were auto mechanics and farm mechanics. One of them went back and got educated, and he was on the team at IBM that developed the barcode scanners that we use every day. So I basically wanted to be Bill Steele and went to Georgia Tech. I got a degree in electrical engineering, but I wanted to be more of a manager. I thought I was being trained for a profession rather than being educated more broadly. So I started studying the role of humanities in a technical education. That work got me admitted to a really top business school. And so then I did ventures for the rest of my career. So this venture in knowledge products was, as I mentioned, audio tapes on these great ideas. We get to moral problems, and it hits me that these are not problems like I'm trained to solve. An engineer looks for an equation or a formula, an algorithm, which is an organized analytical process, and those are not available for moral problems. And what I saw instead was that moral problems are separate truths that are both valid in conflict, and neither one can be fully realized. So this is a straight line to the title of my book, Deep Trade-Offs. It took me years to try to settle on how to describe this. These are beyond pro and con, good and bad, strengths and weaknesses, price and quality. Those kind of trade-offs we make all the time, but very aware of them. These deep trade-offs are things that are going on subconsciously. We're making choices about, am I going to accept and forgive and relent, or am I going to argue and be an activist and confront and demonstrate and all of the rest, right? We make that choice all the time about what we're going to pursue and not. That's chapter 1 of my book, Striving or Peace. We say we want peace, but we struggle, and struggle is not peaceful. So, as an example, that's one of about 30 examples I've identified as a deep trade off.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because uh, I think it's so easy to think I'm right, you're wrong, right?
Yes.
Like we do it in our country with political parties, we do it in churches, we do it in schools, we do it wherever we are. I think it's always happening. The whole I'm right, therefore you're wrong. But you have figured it out that we can both be right.
Yes, and so it comes from being trained as an engineer, where there are right answers and plenty of wrong ones. Rarely are there several right answers. There can be a range of answers, some variations like that. But generally, one answer that's right and a lot that are wrong. and moral problems, and I think more generally the arts, spiritual things, metaphysical things that are not material and measurable, um, are looser in terms of where you find right, where you find truth, because there can be simultaneous truths. Um, and we have then the implication is we have to get away with this habit that there's always a right answer and a wrong answer. If my answer is not acceptable to somebody, it doesn't mean they're wrong. They may have a rival answer that's as worthy as mine in some contexts. And I need to listen to that and understand what different contexts might we need to identify.
It's so interesting because listening, you need to listen, right? And
Yeah,
listening sort of doesn't come natural to people necessarily.
right.
I know for
Yeah,
me, it
right,
didn't necessarily just come natural. Like I lived this year of love and figured out what love is patient is and figured out how to listen, truly listen to people
right,
and hear what they have to
right,
say because it's
right.
not just their words that you then hear. You hear
Yes,
other things. And
yes. Your attitudes, convictions,
right.
beliefs. Yeah,
Yeah, which is why text is difficult. But so one of the things that you've said is that conflict is a feature, not a bug among free people. Tell
yes,
me
and
what you mean by
I
that.
think it's particularly true of free people. It's really true of all people. If you think about it, we have conflicts with our most intimate relationships. Sometimes we conflicted internally because we can't decide one way or the other. We know there's two choices and there's pros and cons for each. So the idea that we need to agree with people before we can love them, before we can like them, before we can be friends with them is just destructive. We need to develop the relationships first, then maybe we can persuade one another. But it's has been so disappointing that we have these pitched political battles and religious battles in some cases, cultural battles, and people come to the conclusion that they have to agree with people they can abide to be with. I think it's more interesting, and I learn more from people that I don't agree with, and we may still disagree. And sometimes it's not tolerable. I don't want to be around them, particularly if they're attacking me for what I think that's different than them. And also if they're trying to make me abide by what they believe and not willing to respect a different belief. That's hard to do, but I try to respect the other guy and as a first step, and maybe they'll follow along.
I think that's such a good point. That is such a good point. Is that you don't have to have confrontations. You can have conversations.
Yeah,
And the reality is, we're all individuals. We're all one of a kind. We're all individually made. And we're the only ones that have walked the steps that we've walked to get to where we are
right.
today. And you
Yes,
pick stuff up along the way. You learn stuff,
right.
you pick stuff up along the way. And when you do, it forms what you believe and it forms how you think. And somebody else is walking a whole different walk. And as much as I might believe something is true, they equally are sure that what they believe is true, even if it's the opposite of what I believe.
In the
So,
90s, there was this fantastic book about multiculturalism called Cultural Literacy by a professor at Virginia, a cognitive scientist. And he basically explained the cognitive theory that we all have a model of the world in our heads, and we hear things and we fit it into that model. We accept it, we are skeptical about it based on what you just described, all these experiences that tell us the way the world is, what's true, what we can rely on, etc. And what he said is in a multicultural society, somebody that doesn't share your culture may not understand reference points. Like the great story I always remember is at Thanksgiving, you may say, I'm going to cook the bird a little bit longer this year. Well, somebody who doesn't come from a culture that celebrates Thanksgiving will see a robin in their head. That's typically what we think of as a bird, right? Cook cook the bird longer. It doesn't make sense. And so he says we put that in short-term memory. We try to listen for more clues that will clarify the meaning. And we've all had those experiences where I quite didn't understand, and then a clue came. Oh, I get it, right?
mhm.
And so people who are not culturally literate end up being overwhelmed and think they're stupid. And so this is what was going on in the 90s. He was basically arguing that we need to have a common experience in our schools so we can talk to one another.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. You know, it kind of goes back to I used to believe, I'm curious how you believe about this, but I used to believe that, man, if two people love each other, it doesn't matter where they're born, where they live, they can make a great marriage no matter what. That's how I used to believe. Then I started seeing cross culture relationships, and some are easy, right? Like you marry a French guy, you marry a Canadian as an American, you marry a guy from London. Those are similar cultures, but if you marry somebody from a culture where it's a male run, male dominated, they might be great courters and tell you how beautiful you are and bring you flowers. But the minute they say I do, it's get me my water and I'm not taking out the trash, or whatever, right? And so, how do you feel about that, or what do you see there?
Well, the first thing I see is that's an argument for long engagements. I've been married 43 years, and I'm fortunate because Susan and I want similar things. We are skeptical of similar things. We we've long known each other enough to trust each other, but we disagree on some things. And the way things have been going in the world recently, there's a few that have popped up that we're really quite different on. But it's okay. I trust that she has good motives in mind, and we really get past it. What other comes to mind is that people from foreign cultures are interesting to me. I love to go to ethnic restaurants. I love to have a new variety of experiences with them. I love to hear things that I hadn't considered that way of thinking. For instance, just go in a foreign country and drive on the left side of the road. You know, it's not that
Right.
the right side is right and they're wrong, right? There's another way. You learn things that you took for granted that are not necessarily granted, like collective nouns. In England, they'll say the government are. We say the government is. My aunt in
Mhm.
West Tennessee would say we was. I thought it was illiterate until I learned in England they use collective nouns as singular. So we was makes sense in that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So just
yeah,
noticing
yeah.
little
Interesting.
subtleties about different ways people do things shed new light about on the way we do things.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure. I think a lot of it too comes down to if you want people to give you the grace to be who you believe you're created to be, then you have to return that grace. And
Exactly.
right? And let people
Exactly.
believe the way they believe and be who they believe they're created to be.
Yeah.
And
One of the
but
ways
and
I put
there's
that in my book is that, we, disagreement is not the problem. Coercion is the problem.
right.
I can think you're doing it wrong, but if I let you do it, fine. Same here. You may think I'm doing it wrong, but don't tell me to change. I don't like to be told what to think.
Yeah, so true. So true. And the reality too, I'm curious about your experience on this, but my experience has been if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they believe something, I believe the truth to be something else, and it's just a conversation, I don't ever change their mind,
Right.
right? Like
That's right. You
I
can't.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, maybe there are times when I walk away from a conversation and go, wow, that was so interesting what they had to say and really think about it. But especially in the moment, my mind isn't necessarily going to be changed and their mind isn't necessarily going to be changed. So to
Yes.
bring it to a level of heat and raised blood pressure and raised voices doesn't make sense because you're not going to all of a sudden turn them your way.
There's a lot of subconscious things going on in that I want to dig into a little bit. But first, I'll say people are loved into change, not shoved into it. I think what you're articulating is that hostility and aggression, it basically pushes people to be defensive. Even if they're wrong, they'll fight you back because you're challenging this whole worldview that they have. Generally, people don't think probabilistically that I'm 80% right, I'm 20%, you're 20% wrong. They think black or white, and you've got to switch completely. Right. There's a great book called Thinking in Bets where this psychologist who was a gambler, poker player, understands the psychology of gambling, and you can make the correct decision and still lose. If 20% happens, you should still always take the 80% choice. And her conclusion from that is that if we have 100% thinking, we've got to change everything in order to get better. And it's not that way. We can change a little bit. So we challenge our own convictions. As I say in the book, think about how strongly you believe what you believe. If the answer is 100%, it's a bad answer because you can't get better with that. And the only people that really are not capable of getting better are either perfect or dead. And we're neither one of those.
Yeah,
So,
that's so true.
yeah,
Yeah.
I learned a lot from a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, who describes uh, confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and these things that we do that are defensive in nature. It's kind of like the fight or flight impulse.
Mhm.
It's innate. It's not something we're thinking about and choosing necessarily. Often we may, but there's an instinct to fight back when we're told that we're wrong and that we're bad. And so his metaphor for that is that the brain is like a big elephant with a rider on top, an Indian rider, right? And so the rider's the rational mind. It's trying to guide the subconscious mind to go where the reason wants it to go. And so the point is that the elephant may go where it wants to go, but we have a little bit of control over it. And it's a 20-80 relationship. I don't think it's precisely measurable, but I've always found that metaphor really useful to recognize what's going on within myself when I have these inchoate or inarticulate urges to fight back or to pick apart somebody's argument that's disagreeing with mine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. That is a great metaphor. I'm going to remember that one forever, I think. Because it's so true that and people evolve, right? Hopefully we're evolving and changing and growing through our lives. And
For
there are
sure.
things that I was sure to be true in my 20s that now I'm real sure are not true.
Are not true. Right.
Right, right. And I'm the same person with
Yeah.
the same mind, but have learned
Yeah.
that
Well,
that
you're alive,
I
right? That's one
right.
of the great joys and beauties of being alive, right? How
Hmm.
boring it would be to have arrived at all of our truths decades ago and never experienced any variety after that. It's terrible.
Yeah, so true. You know, I've got a class reunion coming up. And one thing that I find so interesting about a class reunion is there are so many people that go back to how they were when they were 17 years old. And if they weren't one of the cool kids or whatever, they kind of were off to the side more at the class reunion, they're off to the side more. Even though they lived all these years, accomplished what they have, learned what they have this life, they tend to go. And then the ones that were the cool kids, man, their chests are out and they're surveying the room and they're there. And it's like we're a bunch of 17-year-olds again. And I don't know why that happens, but then our notion of what to expect from somebody is what we expected when they were 17.
It's so
And
interesting. I have two
yeah,
quick stories. My mother went to her 50th high school reunion and she came back talking about the cool people who didn't respect her, but they still don't. They just kind of didn't didn't acknowledge her as much as she would have liked. It's so sad. I was at another reunion of my own. I was standing with some of the pretty, beautiful people when we were in high school, and one of them said, "Oh, that was the highlight of our lives, the best times of our lives." I'm nothing like what I was in high school. I've grown so much, I've learned so much, I've experienced so much. That's a that's just a tragedy walking to hear that kind of view that you peaked when you were 18.
isn't that true? I am hoping I haven't come to my peak yet.
Yes.
That my peak is still something to be pursued. and the best times of my life still something to be pursued. And I've had great stuff in my life, but and I loved high school. I loved it. But there are people that that I know that are kind of stuck in those days, right? Even outside of class reunions, where they were the football quarterback, so they were the talk of the town, and everybody knew who they were, and so it's kind of the glory years. And
Right.
so this whole thinking differently and allowing yourself to think differently, allowing a conversation instead of a confrontation, it's like it's okay to move forward.
Well, you
It's
go,
okay to
girl.
move forward, right?
It is. And, but it raises an interesting corollary point. And, we're proclaiming the glories of being open-minded and changing and all of that, but it's another trade-off. There are also reasons to be closed-minded about some things. I'm kind of closed-minded about extramarital affairs. Okay. I have a very
Mhm.
good marriage. I'm not really very tempted, but I do see good looking women walking around occasionally. But it's just not an option. My mind is closed to that. And I think it should be. So, Anthony Bourdain, the chef, who nobody would call a conservative, I have a quote from him where he said he felt so comfortable in the kitchen because he knew what to expect. It was like home. Home is another idea. That's not open and experiential. It's comforting and known and predictable and all of those warm emotions we get. So I'm trying to develop the practice of always looking for the alternative to any proclamation. Yes, I like liberty, but liberty unbounded produces a lot of inequality. Yeah. And
What a
so we
kind of a
talk,
statement is that, Mike? Holy cow.
yeah. And
It's
people who
true.
want ultimate equality, everybody to be equal, you have to quash liberty so much to accomplish that, you wouldn't recognize the world we live in, and people would not tolerate it. Um, but I have this theory that any value has an alternative, a rival, a competitor that challenges it. So I did an experiment. I went on the internet and I looked for value inventories, and I compiled from 3 or 4 sources a list of about 200 values. And I went down in a spreadsheet and I just looked at each one and think, what would be the alternative to that? And in every case, I could identify one, some stronger than others, but in every case, there's another value that may overcome this one in some circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. Give me some examples of that. Because
Well,
that is,
I've got the spreadsheet right here, you see?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'll just take some at random and hopefully
Yeah.
they're good ones. Courtesy. Who
Mm.
can argue with courtesy, right? Well, no nonsense is kind of an alternative to that. Sometimes a lot of tact and pretend goes in courtesy where people are not saying what they think. And brash no nonsense like you might find in New York doesn't have a lot of tact with it, right?
Yeah. Right.
There's
Right.
reasons for both, right?
Hmm.
Um, Ambition would be one. Contentment and sacrifice is the opposite. Sacrifice is the opposite of ambition. And
Mm.
authority, autonomy.
Mm. Wow.
We make our own choices or we follow somebody else's. Being attentive or being dreamy.
Mm.
See,
Interesting.
so I'm just picking
Wow.
out that Ramthy. Uh, Being empathetic, well, self-caring. Some people
Right.
don't pay enough attention to themselves. And I've seen people talk about the virtues of loving yourself, right?
Right. Right. Wow.
Being
Yeah.
energetic, being calm.
Mm.
So I could go on. There's 200. I won't bore you with it, but one of these days I may write about that whole collection of values and everyone having an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you should. That there's a lot there that would make a great book because I've never thought that way before.
Right.
It's but also, do you have to pick one or the other, or is there a middle anywhere, or basically it's your values are one or the other?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so, do you have any convictions that you jar down on and just say, I'm not going to tolerate the other side? Maybe so. I said some remark ways I'm not open-minded, but I think I am in other ways, right? So, in the
Mhm.
end, these both have play. I think they both deserve recognition and respect. And in most cases, we balanced them. And so this is where we're edging away from this paradigm of right and wrong. And if you think differently, you must hate what I love. Well, no, there is a room for both. And let me put it this way: if I asked you, what is the meaning of life? We could be here for 2 weeks, maybe, and probably not coming to an agreement on what is the meaning of life. But if I say, where do you find meaning in life, Kim? Well,
Mm,
you probably have a selection of 3 or 4 places that are really meaningful to you. I have my own. They may not be the same, but there's really no doubt that those all are truths, right? For
right.
you, for me, they're different kinds of truths. Yes, people are skeptical of your truth and my truth, and it unmoors us from the idea that there's a capital T truth that's absolute and unbending and universally applicable. I'm just deeply suspicious of anything being universally true. But science that's its purpose, is to find where do we find agreement through experiment and skeptical critical analysis. It's pretty tough to get a lasting truth in science, but you find a formula, an equation that predicts something over and over and over. Quantum mechanics was weird, weird, weird when they discovered it a century ago, but now it's embedded in electronics that so much, and it's so proven, and we've done so much with it in terms of producing wealth and prosperity, autonomy, computing in our clothes and our in our pockets. That it's a pretty reliable truth that those mechanical observations are true. So the point being, there's always new truths to discover, but there's also a bunch of truths that have been around that are fighting with one another. And if we just look at the world a little bit differently, we can find it easier to get along with people that have a different priority.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's true. And when we get away from them, right? When we get away from us and them, or me and them, like,
Right.
oh, they believe this, or they are like this, or they are,
Right.
and we
Right.
get back down to individual and
Yes.
recognize the value of the individual,
Yes.
and that they're not their political party. They're
Yes.
not the country that they're born in. They're
Yes.
not the color of their skin. They're not their sexual orientation. Those there might be clubs you belong to. There might be aisles that you walk down, but that's not who you are. Who you are is this incredible individual. Nobody like you. Nobody ever will be, ever, and nobody ever has been. And that is who you are, which
Right.
means that's who everybody else is. And when we
So
can
you're
see
talking,
people that way, right?
yeah, yeah, you're talking about identity, and I made a list of 30 different ways people can identify themselves. Profession, family relationships, friendships, hobbies, interests, the way you think, you are what you eat, you are what you do, you are what you think. There's a million ways to come at identity, but we tend to gravitate to two or three in our political culture: race, gender, and political orientation. Right? It just boils down to three things. It's impoverishing to think of people that way.
Mm-hmm.
When my son was in elementary school, he came home one day and said, I have a new friend. And he said, tell us about him. And he said, well, he's skinny and he's got a rat tail and he's energetic, he's jumpy. And there was about 5 or 6 things like that. I think it was the seventh one was he said, he's black. And I thought, I have gotten my money's worth from this private school that I'm sending him to, because he's around difference and he doesn't see it. He sees the person before he sees the category. And that's enormously valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sure is. Funny story. We were sitting around the dinner table one time, and my son Noah had a friend over, and maybe they were 7 or maybe even 8 years old. And something came up, and his friend's father was from Africa. And so Teddy. And so something came up. Teddy said something about Black people. And Noah's like, Black people? I've never seen a Black person. And Teddy said, well, I'm Black. But you're not Black, you're brown. What are you talking about? And then he said, no, I'm Black and you're white. He said, I'm not white. I'm kind of pinkish. And so I just thought,
That's wonderful.
that's right, right, right.
What a
We're
great
all
story.
different shades. Yeah, yeah. And when my
Yeah.
grandkids were little and a new baby was coming into the family, I've got one of our family, a very multicultural family, but two sisters that one is white and one is black. And they didn't care about the gender, if it was a boy or girl. They were excited to see what color the baby was going to be.
Yeah.
They didn't know that it took two white people to make a white child, or that didn't matter to them. They didn't care. They just thought, well, they're kind of going to look like me or they're going to look like her, and
Right.
but not in absolutely a negative way, but just
Right.
that's the reality. Babies are born, they're either, they're different colors. And so that's all okay.
I've
So,
had difficulties sometimes with people that can't figure out whether they want me to see their difference or ignore their difference.
interesting.
So, because I believe in colorblind kind of attitudes. We're all, deserve similar dignity, right? We're not all equal. We have different talents and backgrounds and capacities for risk, and we're going to end up in different places. We're not going to be the same or have the same, but we all deserve similar dignity. And I've been in debates where it was challenging. I was being challenged to make someone different, treat them differently because of their race or their gender. And I kind of resisted. So there's a place for that. I treat my wife differently than I treat my brother. But in terms of just general human dignity, I don't like to separate people out like that and say, you're a different class of person than me. Or I'm going to judge you because of a class you're in. I think that's off.
Right, right. Or assume you're going to be a certain way because of whatever.
Right.
I think that I've run into the same thing. And I used to use the word colorblind. And I found out that that was offensive to some people. And so anything
Mm-hmm.
that's offensive, I just stay away from. But because I really don't see people's color, I don't even notice my own gender until it's pointed out to me, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
doing work on the docks in Haiti, like I did for years, and no women are down there, it's all men. And I'd be pushing my container through, trying to get the paperwork done. And then someone would recognize the fact that I'm a woman and I would be stopped because I'm a woman. And so then I'm like, oh yeah, or in business, until somebody points it out. I mean, it's because you just are who you are. But colorblind, I think, can mean a couple different things. One is, I think the way you and I both are, that color doesn't matter, right? So therefore, you don't have to recognize somebody's color. But colorblind to some people, I think, can mean that because you're blind to my color,
You're not
you're
seeing who
you're
I am.
less, yeah, you're not seeing who I am. You're less
Right.
likely to understand me.
Right. Well,
Right.
this brings to mind, a corollary to this right versus wrong we were talking about. I've heard people say, I went out and talked to people who are different, and they're just like me. Well, the point here is they're just like you in some regards. They are not like you in some regards, right? They're just like you and they're different from you at the same time. Just like we can be right and right, wrong and wrong. There's this muddy middle. I think it serves us well to live in. One of the
Mm-hmm.
points I make in my book is that when people start to divide off and say you're with me or against me, that's what Sherman said during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Bush said before the Iraq War started. And I think one lesson to take away from that is that the conflicted and riotous middle is a good place to be because it means we're alive and we're dealing with our challenges.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So interesting. Yeah. I think it's just kind of assumed in so many ways that you have to take a side.
Right.
It's like White Sox or Cubs. Sorry, you can't like both teams. Pick one, right? We're in the Lions and the Cowboys, just pick a lane, pick a
Well,
team.
tribalism is pretty deeply embedded in us, right? If you think about how cultures must have developed over time, people speculate about the original state of nature and what it was like. But I think it's pretty clear that in primitive areas, people live in tribes. They have to depend on each other, and procreate and some division of labor and things like that. And my understanding is that 30 to 50 to 70 is kind of a normal size for a tribe. But that's how you organize who you trust, right? You trust people in your tribe, you distrust people outside. Some religions are still built on that idea that I treat people who believe that are believers one way, and I treat infidels the other way. I think that's not a great way to think. And we
It's
live in a
not,
universal world now where we're trying to be more universal in our regard for people who we consider as neighbors and things like that. We're not all neighbors, and I can't take care of 8 billion people or even
right.
care about 8 billion people. I'm not capable of it. But I think you see the tension I'm trying to draw is that who do we trust? Who do we extend our care to? They're hard choices. And the point is, we're still stuck in this balancing act.
Yeah. Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice if there wasn't a balancing act? And we
Well,
did just kind of accept everybody. I mean, I know that there's got to be I, I'm glad not everybody believes the way I do. Exactly the things that I, you know, am that I believe. I'm glad that not everybody does. It would be a boring world if
right.
everybody thought exactly the way I do. So I'm glad that people think differently and can think differently. They're allowed to think differently, and that's okay. But there are some things that I think, man, why? How has it gotten to this? Like for instance, God. I believe there's one God. I believe in God. I believe there's one. So do the Muslims,
Right.
and believe it's the same God. And
Right.
so do
So do Jews.
Jewish people, and it's
Right.
the same God.
Right.
So here we are believing in the same God, which is ultimately the big thing, right?
Right.
That's the big one. Do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God? Believe how you want. But here we believe in God, but then we have conflict because because of other things. And then within the church, there's conflict because of other things. I was raised Catholic, and I went to an Assembly of God church for years, and I went to a non-denominational church, and when I was at anything but a Catholic church, there's so many misconceptions about Catholics. And there's even people that think that Catholics are going to hell because of how they believe. And it's like, well, isn't it the same God and the same Jesus? Like, what, how did this happen? This division? Why, why is there
There are
such
conflicts.
division?
There are conflicts in three-person families, in two-person families. There are conflicts. The more people there are, the more differences there are, and the more sources of conflict there be. It takes an act of will to get beyond those and emphasize what's in common, right? But
Mm,
this is back to the point that conflict is inevitable. It's not some. It doesn't mean something's wrong and somebody's right and the other person must be wrong if they disagree with it. Conflict is inevitable. There's too much variety in the world to think otherwise.
yeah. Well,
And I have
I
friends
love
who are
that.
Hindu, by the way. They don't
Yeah.
believe in one God. And I think they're wonderful people.
Right. Right.
And I'm not entirely confident that there is one God. I haven't met him yet.
Yeah.
And so I may say I believe that, but I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong. That's what it means to have faith, in my view, and not knowledge. I used to have arguments with my mother when I was a teenager. And this kind of formed when I went to engineering school. I was wanting to delve into this, learn more about it, because I had arguments with mom that she would say, I know there's a God. And I say, how do you know? You know, where did you find this? Have you been there? And she couldn't answer those things, but that's where I really got interested in how do we know what we think we know. And I've
Mm-hmm.
learned that we believe what we wish to be true.
Ah, that's a cool statement.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's packed. I mean, you need to slow
Mhm.
down and unpack it, but it's true. We see what we want to be true. We've just been through an episode of that in our culture. Believing somebody was fully capable of having a job who was very clearly losing their cognitive abilities and sharpness, and people
Mhm.
pretended otherwise for a long, long time because of the consequences. And the way I deal with this in my book is talking about the story of the naked emperor. It was a
Mhm.
child that said the emperor's naked. All of the adults were afraid to say it because of the consequences of calling that out were unfathomable, unfaceable.
Mm-hmm.
And we do the same thing. If we don't want to acknowledge that we're going to die in about another 20 years, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people hide from that. Some things
Right.
need to be hidden from because some realities are so terrible that you just don't want to contemplate them. And I tell the story in this, there's a chapter on honesty and deception in my book. There's striving and peace, ideals and reality, honesty and deception are the three basic trade-offs I deal with in the book. And then a chapter on what to do with all the techniques for dealing with difference and disagreement. But in a chapter on honesty and deception, um, you know, I talk about how often we fool ourselves. We pretend something's true because we wish it to be true. And sometimes the scales have to fall from our eyes for us to do better.
Yeah. 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 That's so interesting. That is a deep thought. There's so many deep thoughts that you just kind of keep throwing out that I go, oh my gosh, that's so good. That's so good. And yeah, so to give it a thought and think that there's another way to look at things, another way to behave around others, whatever. Um, I think the other thing that it does is sometimes having strong convictions can be a little poisonous because
Yes,
right, like
yes,
in the church, for instance, in the church it's like, well, I believe that I believe that I believe, I believe. Well, then there's no room for any hint of doubt or any hint of wonder or any hint of is everything that I've ever been told exactly the truth, right? And so then you can be a person who has wonder, who wants to
yes,
know, who has some
that's
doubt,
right. Yeah,
and
the,
they're going
the
to
world's
leave.
more alive when it's less settled, in my view. The more
Yeah.
settled we are, the more comfortable we are, the more dead we are. And
Yeah.
so I used to think that there's belief kind of things we don't know, but we kind of think to be true. We trust them to be true. Like you treat people well, and that's the way to be well and do well, as opposed to treating people with hostility and anger and exploitation. You know, there's a lot of evidence that you can get ahead pretty well by exploiting people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people believe that's the way most people get ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't believe that. I believe the way we live is more um, shall we say, positive and constructive. Yeah, but I don't know it. I believe it. And I used to think there's belief and then there's conviction that's kind of stronger belief. There's more evidence, there's more experience that kind of hardens that to be even more reliable. And then, then there's truth that's proven somehow maybe. Well, I don't believe that anymore because I read a quote by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in this philosophy um, series that we did in Knowledge Products. And he has this quote that said, convictions are a greater enemy of truth than our lies.
Mm-hmm. Will
That
you say
just
that
didn't make
again, please?
sense to me. Convictions are greater enemies of truth than lies.
Mm.
What he was saying is that convictions close our minds. Once we have
Mhm.
concluded something, we're not listening to anything else, and we may very well be wrong. And if you take this view that I've mentioned, that there's a balance of things to consider, and nothing is ever completely right all the time, then you lock yourself into that belief. You can't be persuaded because you're not listening.
Right.
So it's an
Right.
enemy of truth. You will never get to the truth because you've accepted a partial truth.
Right. Your truth.
Yeah,
Your truth. What you choose
yeah.
to believe.
Yours
What you
only, your
choose.
perspective only.
Your perspective only. Right. Nobody else's. Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. Yeah. I like, the whole. So another thing you said is that every truth is a half truth. And so
Yes,
that goes along with what you're saying,
yes.
right?
Yeah, it's another way of saying really the same thing, that we shouldn't depend on any of these as being 100% reliable truths. That quote, there's a quote from a pretty famous philosopher who said that. And I don't think he's doing math here. He's not saying it's exactly 50%. I think he's saying it's a partial truth.
Mm. Yeah.
Some are more reliable than others.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it is that it's okay. That it's okay. It's
For there
okay
to be
to
partial truths. Yes.
for that. Yeah, yeah, that's okay. It's
Yeah.
okay to, believe something's true, but also then recognizing you believe it's true because you want it to be true, or you believe it's true because you think it's true,
Yeah.
because it's true to you.
Or in some situations, it might not be true. Have said I think it's good to be kind to people and to respect them and all that. I'm not very kind and respectful of people that are trying to rape my daughter.
Mm,
Okay. Not
right,
going to do it. Right. And
right.
so we say, for instance, some people say that the truth is their highest priority. They all believe in it ultimately should always tell the truth. Well, we
Hmm.
don't. We'd rather survive than tell the truth.
Yeah,
we'd
yeah.
rather we'd rather lie than be subjected, and coerced. You'll tell people lies that are trying to dominate you, right, to get
Right.
away. Terrorism is one way of trying to short circuit war. It's a way of we did this tape of war and terrorism, and I heard that the sirens that used to wail, you see the old movies, and they're coming down, the sirens are wailing, and then a bomb goes off. Well, those sirens were not part of the normal aerodynamics of the plane and the bomb. They were placed there to scare the enemy. They
Mm,
wanted them to be afraid. So it's a psychological weapon. Just like terrorism is a psychological weapon, sometimes violent, but you're trying to win by any means necessary.
mhm. Right, right, right. Because you're standing on your truth
Yeah,
and not allowing, you don't want to even allow somebody else's truth.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. Okay, so one of the things you said that I found fascinating is that stories can be true even if they never happened.
Yes, I learned this in a religious context from Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a pastor and a kind of a divinity school kind of person. I'm not sure she's actually at a divinity school. She writes a lot of books. And her point was a lot of the things that we think about in a religious context, stories, parables, etc., may never have literally happened. But that's not the way that the reason they were written and the reason they're told. They're told as an example to teach us something. Here we're again into the idea that arts and fiction and literature don't have the kind of truths that science has. They're representational truths rather than literal, factual, evidence-backed things. And so we may hear a story about Jonah in the whale's mouth. It's not really too interesting to believe, that a whale ate a man. you know, Maybe it's kind of interesting, but who cares, right? What matters is it represents a kind of overwhelming uh, adversary, adversarial situation that you're out of control and there's great threats and evils and stuff like that, however you want to interpret it. But the symbol there is what we're after. What does the symbol mean? What does it teach us? So a story can be uh, true, but it never happened. And I start out the chapter on honesty and deception with a story of George Washington and the cherry tree. If you go to the Mount Vernon website, they say historians now believe that story is not true.
Oh,
It
yeah.
didn't. It was written for the first time about 7 years after Washington was dead. Okay, so this was a guy trying to talk about Washington's character. So if you insist on interpreting as a literal historical fact, it's probably false. But if you take it as a storytelling way of saying that this is a man of integrity who
Mhm.
founded our country, well,
Mhm.
it's not literally true. It's symbolically true. It can be true. It never happened.
You know what I'm loving about this? When that uh people are shunned, people are dismembered, not their limbs, but they're kicked out of the membership.
Yes.
If in an instance they don't believe that Jonah was actually in the mouth of a whale, right? So some people can't handle that. There are people that maybe don't believe that that literally happened, and the opposite. People are going, "How can you believe that literally happened?" But when you come down to it, it's the point of the story, and
Right.
that's something we should all be able to agree on. Is
Yes.
that's what it is no matter if it literally happened or didn't literally happen, is inconsequential. Like that doesn't even matter because what a great point that story makes. And that's
It's
why it's told and told and retold, right?
that's why I'm religiously active. And there's poetry, there's symbolism, there's all this rich, um, uh, immaterial things. You know, metaphysical is another word. Metaphysical things that can't be measured. We're not going to solve it by going to a scientist and asking him to do an experiment, right? It just doesn't apply. Back to my point about arts and sciences before. So, I also decided when I became more religiously active in my early adulthood that I don't believe those things, but I'm not going to challenge people who do.
Mm,
A lot of people I could see were depending on their understanding of what was going to happen to them at their death. And I did not need to upset that. I don't know that I'm right, right? My interpretation of things, like my wife and I disagree on that. She thinks there's a heaven. I don't, right? I think heaven is on the earth where when we're living, treating people well and have done our best and are fulfilled and satisfied. To me, that's heaven. The theologian Julia Child said, "Hell is when we're paying for our mistakes on earth." Right.
mm,
So it's a similar opposite
mm,
side of the coin, but a similar point of view that heaven and hell are on earth. They're conditions in our lives. But plenty of people around me think that heaven and hell are after death, and I'm not one to challenge it because I don't know. It just
yeah.
doesn't compel me as much to think that way.
Right. 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 Yeah. It's so interesting. And uh and it's okay, right?
Yeah, sure it is.
So yeah, so you said imagination is often a vicious liar.
So the second chapter is on imagination and reality, and starts out with stories of people attempting to build utopias that failed within 1 or 2 years. In every case, utopias that have been tried have failed because human nature is not perfect, and we can't create a place with only virtue and no vice. Um, and so we want to imagine, though, that the world can be perfected. We try to make it better. We get more educated. We discipline ourselves to lose weight, to be kinder, to all these things. And you can get a little better with discipline, but we cannot perfect ourselves. Now, I can't scientifically prove it. I'll let somebody believe it who thinks that they can perfect themselves or perfect others, even less likely.
Right. Right.
But the contrast I was trying to draw is that great quote, that the permanent uh, defeat of life is to have your dreams defeated by reality. Uh, I wish I could get this quote right. Uh, but the perm. Let's see. Tragedy of life is to not accept. I'm not doing this well at all, but it's tragic if you don't live your dreams.
Hmm.
Okay, um, and so, but it's also unfortunate if we don't realize that we don't live in a dream. We live in a real world where there are shortcomings and shortfalls. So I say it a lot better in the book, but we're trapped between what we think should be and what is. James Baldwin is a novelist who says we're trapped between is and ought. We all have different ideas of ought. There ought to be no gas cars. There ought to be no government. There ought to be no injustice. There ought to be complete love, right? Those are ideals. They're unlikely to ever exist on this earth. At least they haven't in the several thousands of years that we have recorded history. So the point
Right.
is to understand imagination and ideals as a tool to dream of a better world. Science fiction has dreamed of a lot of things that have become reality: submarines, elevators, credit cards,
It's true.
Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
and the rocket scientist Goddard said, God pity a one dream man. You know,
Mm.
we achieve one dream and we go reaching for another one. And that's part of the wonder of life, I think. But we also have to understand that we're never, in the religious language, we're never going to be gods ourselves. In
Mm.
secular language, we can never be perfect. We have to live with our shortcomings and forgive our own shortcomings and those of others.
Yeah. Holy cow. So much. Uh, and yeah, it's seems to me such a better way to approach the world and approach
I think
life.
so. I think
Yeah.
so. So I'm
Yeah.
writing about it. Yeah.
Right, right, right. So you don't get defensive and you don't get angry. You don't get whatever. You're
Right.
open-minded.
Right.
You're willing to listen to people. You want to listen to people. You want to hear the differences. You want to
Yeah.
work it out for yourself, whatever it is. And in the end, believe how you believe. It's all
Yeah.
good,
And the
right?
trick is to affirm your beliefs, even if you're listening. You're not equivocal, and it's not like you don't care. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to resign from caring because you can't know the right answer. You can. I hired a guy to do a series on religion in this audio publishing business who had been in our Sunday school. He was the best I'd ever seen at affirming his own beliefs. He was a Northern Baptist. He wasn't even Presbyterian like we were, but he was teaching us about Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and other faith traditions with enormous respect. And I thought that is just a great balance that he struck there. He believes what he believes. He's not aggressive or defensive about it, but he's very positive and respectful of something that's so different. And that's what I think a point I'm trying to make is this equivocation. Equal voice is what equivocation means, right? It usually means you can't decide between one and the other. You're on a seesaw, and you kind of don't know what you think. I'm proposing a more positive version of that is that I know what I think, but I also know the alternatives and the challenges to it. And I've just chosen what I choose, and I know what I'm giving up by not choosing the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So another thing that you said that I think is worth bringing up is that happiness and meaning are active, not passive.
Yes. So the chapter one on striving and peace talks a lot about what does it mean to strive? What do we strive for? And it's pretty clear in the psychological literature that we do not find fulfillment on the couch in front of a TV with a remote in our hands. That fulfillment is found in being active and engaged. There's a guy named Csikszentmihalyi, it's a Hungarian name, wrote a book called Flow. And he studied, he put buzzers on people and he would buzz them at random times of day and say, are you experiencing flow? Which is defined as this psychological condition where you're just into something, like you come up for air after a few hours.
Mm-hmm.
Or a baseball player may see the ball float in front of them as it's coming at 90 miles an hour because their sense of time is altered in both cases. It either speeds up or slows down, but it takes you out of your worries and your distractions. And I've heard prayer described that way as doing away with all the little shopping lists and things and focusing calmly on something.
Mm-hmm.
So this psychological experience of flow is happens when we're active, not when we're passive.
Mm-hmm.
This is what he discovered, and there's other people who have found corollary things that support this, but doctors are pretty clear. They'll say life is motion. Philosophers say the enemy is inactivity. People who are dying will say what I regret is what I didn't do, not what I did, is what I didn't do. So I take all of these things and form them into a coherent whole. And one of the conclusions from that is that activity is where we find life and fulfillment.
Mm. Yeah, that's so good. That's so true. Yes, and you hear people say it's like it happened in slow motion, right? Like
Yes,
a
right.
car accident sometimes can be like that, or like like you said, the baseball player all of a sudden, man, that ball it slows down. He can see it so well. It's as if it slows down. He's got all the time in the world to go and hit a home run, and it's interesting that our brains can do that.
Yeah,
That time I think time is we've put parameters around time. Like
yeah,
we've decided what time is, right? Like
right.
we made up the calendar, we made up hours and minutes and seconds. And so we decided what time is, but there's probably a lot more to time than we give time credit for.
Yeah, there's a case to be made that time doesn't exist objectively. It's a framework we put on our experience in order to make sense of it. Right?
Mm,
And logical things like, there's There's a sequence of things that have to happen. I heard once the quote that God invented interest rates so everything wouldn't happen at once. So, but there's a natural, logical things that happen about time. But some philosophers make a pretty persuasive case that a lot of our mistakes about time is because our framework about it is not applicable or just not perfected, as opposed to time there being a grand clock out there somewhere that we've got to find and follow. Um,
Very
so yeah,
interesting.
there's a lot of stuff in there to say about time. But what I will, another thing I'll say about being passive is that we think that vacations and relaxation are where we're going to find fulfillment,
Mm.
right? And we do need to get away from stress and burdens of that kind. But it does, at least it doesn't take me very long to get bored and be looking for something to be engaged in, to be alive about. I think it would be great to fall in love again. You know, it may happen in friendships for me. I hope it doesn't need to happen personally because I have a great marriage. But, think how wonderful that is to fall in love. Some people think it's worth doing many times and they're willing to be serial monogamists, right? I'm
And
not.
willing to be on the other end of it and be hurt,
That's right.
right?
That comes with it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but that engagement, I think that in the context of where we're talking about the engagement, the being alive, is so much to be cherished, and it just doesn't happen when we're resigned. And I think it was Jane Austen said, people want activity, and they'll make it happen if it doesn't come to them.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Great quote. That's a great quote. Okay, so we've got like a minute left. So what's your biggest piece of advice, or what would you say to people if you were able to just tell people whatever it is you want to tell them? What is it that you'd say?
Well, first I would say read Deep Trade-Offs because it's got everything we didn't say here, right? And some of
Right.
what we did say. But the big piece, just in the nature of the title, Deep Trade-Offs, think hard about what we've been talking about for the last hour, and that there are rival forces in the world, values, principles, goals, that compete with one another. None of them are completely reliable. And once we start to think this way, we see it everywhere. We see trade-offs between focus and sensitivity. I'm very focused. My son has a attention deficit disorder when he was a child. And I learned those are opposite poles. I was literally insensitive when I was focusing. He's unfocused when he's distracted.
Mm.
So, there are dozens of these kind of trade offs. Just be alert to them.
Mhm. Yeah. And give some grace. Give people grace. Let people be who
Exactly.
they are and
Including
forgive all
ourselves.
they do, including
Yeah.
yourself. Exactly. Exactly. Grace begins at home. There.
Yes.
Kim Sorrell says, grace begins at home. I don't know if anybody
Love
said
it.
that before, so I'll take that. I'll
Yeah.
take that quote.
I love
Mike,
it.
this has been an absolute pleasure. It's you I love the way you are opening minds, that you're getting us outside our boxes, that you're giving us permission to think differently. And I just appreciate you so much. The book is fantastic. Everybody, it's available on Amazon, other booksellers online, wherever you can find it. Amazon is super easy, but
Yes.
Deep Trade-Offs,
Yes. That's the
Mike
title.
Hassel,
Yep.
and just uh, think about what you heard today, and think about how you react the next time you react to something. Think
Yes.
about why you're reacting that way, and how you should be reacting. And so this was so great. Thank you so much, Mike.
I've
And
loved this conversation. I hope we can have more.
yes, yeah, me too. Me too. Absolutely. We're going to have more for sure.
Okay.
So thank you for joining us. And until next time, be blessed.